All right, I am Rob Waddell. I'm in the history department here at the University of Rhode Island, and this is another in our continuing series of conversations with folks that were involved in civil rights movement and other civil rights kinds of activities in the 60s and on up into the present day. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to let Michael introduce himself, and then we'll just have some conversation about his experiences from there.
And I'm Mike Van Leesten. I was very privileged to be involved in the civil rights movement way back as a student in the 60s, and have been able to have an appreciation for what it's meant to America and to our Constitution, and the importance of our young people who have a sense of what it meant to the growth and development of our country and making our Constitution live up to its promise.
So where I've been starting with folks is to get a little bit of where they come from originally, and how that leads into some of their civil rights activities. And if I'm doing a much longer interview, we might talk even more about childhood and all that. Yeah. But tell us a little bit at least about where you grew up and how that sort of led you to where you ended up in the 1960s.
I grew up in Providence, a product of the public school system, lived on the east side when that was the predominantly black neighborhood way back in those days, and went to Rhode Island College from 1961 to 65 during the height of the civil rights movement. And as a Rhode Islander, enjoyed the niceness of playing sports and all that entailed, and just having a pretty good old life for a colored kid at that point, not recognizing appreciating what was wrong that was going on in America, reading and hearing a lot about Dr. King and the sit-ins, and they were kind of strange to me back then. I didn't quite understand nor had a deep relationship or feeling for it, but a certain set of events occurred that then turned the light switch on and got me engaged and involved.
So you were at Rhode Island College, and you started in 61, you said?
I started in 61.
61. And what years were you active in the movement then?
My first level of involvement was in 1962. And let me just back up and give you a little bit of history in terms of how I got involved in 62 and 63. My freshman year had no interest in civil rights movement, couldn't connect with it, read a lot about it, knew it had some relationship to the unfairnesses in the South and all that, but didn't recognize similar injustices and things that were going on here in the North as well as nationally. But there were, it was kind of convergence of three kind of intellectual events. One was, at the time, my first freshman research paper was on the internment of Japanese in America, and that was kind of strange to me. And people thought it was strange for a black guy, I wasn't black during that time, was colored or Negro, would write about the internment of Japanese people, and I found that kind of strange. At the same time, I can recall there was an introduction to me by a fellow student. He said, "Mike, you ought to read this book." And it was called The Negro Revolt. It was written by a national known syndicated columnist named Louis Lomax. And it just described the whole history of the civil rights movement and the Supreme Court decision and the black Muslims and what was happening in the South. And so I read that book simultaneously with doing the paper. And then thirdly, I wrote another paper on Charles Baird's economic institution on the Constitution of the United States, where his whole theory was that it was wealth and the favoring of wealthy people and landowners. And that was what really framed and drove the Constitution. I thought about that and I said, gee whiz, this is interesting. Something's wrong here, at least in my mind, after all that intellectual collision that occurred. And then I started to get engaged more to try to understand what was going on in the civil rights movement, and heard about a voter registration drive that was going to take place in Atlanta, Georgia, led by, because that's where Dr. King and Andrew Young and Hosea Williams wanted to establish the beachhead for the civil rights movement from Atlanta. There were black institutions, the colleges, and some black-owned businesses, so there was a level of stability and protection that existed. A call out to students to come and register voters in Atlanta, Georgia. So I went with maybe a couple of hundred students from around the country back in '62. And for about 3 or 4 weeks, we were down there registering voters in Atlanta to create Atlanta as the beachhead.
Was that in the summer? Or
Yeah, it was during the spring. It's funny, it was during the spring break.
Okay.
And I ended up staying a little longer than I should have. And I got back into classes 2 weeks late, but I was able to pick up where I left off. But that got me my first exposure into the civil rights movement.
So I'm curious. One thing that strikes me is that it seems as though when you were getting involved in this and you had these things that sort of spurred you into thinking in new ways about American history and about the Black freedom struggle and so on. In your mind, at that point, this was still very much a Southern phenomenon? Yeah,
it was a Southern phenomenon, and then I thought it's a Black problem, and then I realized that it's an American problem, an American challenge, and it wasn't just a Southern issue. It just wasn't a Black issue. It was an issue that had to do with the Constitution and living up to what the noble principles were in that Constitution. So then I took on a much larger look at it in terms of what it all meant. So I sort of evolved from someone that didn't really get involved to someone who now saw what I felt was a much larger picture of what the civil rights movement meant to America.
So was there anything that, because for a lot of folks, they would if they encountered some of the stuff that you would encounter, and they'd be interested and they read and they would continue to want to do research and write and think. But how do you get to that point where you're not just intrigued by this and moved by some of this, but where you sign up to go down to Atlanta and try to register to people to vote? I mean, how is it that happens for you?
Well, then what happened amidst all these other intellectual things I love to read, but then something personal happened. And that personal thing was I was looking for an apartment on the east side of Providence, down by Wayland Square, with my roommate, a guy named Harold Hopkins. And it was a room for rent. And with nice students, good students. And when I went to apply for the apartment, I was told that it was taken. Well, I got an instinctive feeling that this guy was lying to me. So my roommate, who was white, he went down and asked the guy the same question. Is that room? He said, oh, yes. So that was that really struck me. And that color didn't matter. Color did make a difference, no matter how smart or thoughtful that I was, because the color of my skin really made a difference in being denied the right that most people, especially white people, enjoy daily. And I began to think, I said, damn, because I wasn't thinking that way. I said, here I am, my parents, my father and mother always wanted me to go to school, and everybody saying do the right thing, playing sports, getting along with everybody, and that ain't enough. Then it must be color, and therefore that was a demarcation for me in terms of understanding that color does make a difference, and that there is a distinction, and that the change needed to be made, both in the mindset of Black people as well as white people.
Mm-hmm. Now, was there anything at the time that was going on locally here in Rhode Island that you might have attached yourself to, as well? Or?
Very much so. And then there was a series of incidents, just as in your own life. It just wasn't one incident that created you. There was a convergence of a bunch of different things that resulted into what you're doing now. So I had all these things that I mentioned. And then it just so happened that a minister came to town named Reverend Arthur Hodge, whose bust is out in front of the Multicultural Center now. And he headed up the Rhode Island chapter of CORE, which is one of the major national advocacy issues on behalf of Black people in the country in the early 60s. So he came here, and he formed a Rhode Island chapter. At the same time, fair housing was a major issue, and I was the direct recipient of being denied. So when he came on the CORE, and that was a mantle of their central approach to try to attack, I was involved with a woman by the name of Sheila Cabral Souza, who we co-chaired a group called Rhode Island Students for Equality, and we organized URI students, Bryant, Rhode Island College, Providence College, RISD, and Brown, to fight for fair housing. And we organized numerous demonstrations, slept in at the State House and picketed places and did things during those, probably in 1963. So that was another iteration, evolution of what I got involved in with the leadership of the Rhode Island Students for Equality. Still a kid.
Yeah, yeah. So you went, it was in '62 you went down to Atlanta.
Right.
And was that your first venture out of...
That was my first venture.
I mean, folks in Rhode Island, so it was the first time out of Rhode Island, or
Yep.
was it first at least out of New England?
First one.
Yeah.
First
And so, how did you get down there?
Well, basically, we just we had cars, and there was, I think, 4 or 5 of us from Rhode Island, and the rest from around the country. We went down there for that, and that was a pretty. It wasn't like an intense Ku Klux Klan and all the other things that you read about that happened during those times, but that was more within a relatively sophisticated city. There was the black institutions and businesses, and there was Dr. King and churches and things. So it was somewhat of a protected, yet it was still a southern environment getting through that stuff. But it wasn't as dangerous as the next phase of involvement that many of us got involved in.
So and then we could talk. I want to move on and talk about some of that stuff, even though I could talk about this all day. But so when you as a person of color that's driving down in, I mean, did you get instructed and like you can't stop at places when you're driving down, and when you hear stories of when people tell their stories about in the Jim Crow South of when they would travel or when they would go up north to visit relatives, and they had to drive the entire way through because you couldn't stop anywhere, wasn't safe to stop. I mean, was that your experience?
You just reminded me of something, because I went down there with a couple of folks from 2 cars, a couple of folks from Rhode Island, and there was about 3 or 4 students from Cornell, and they were all white. I was the only black one in the crowd. And as we were driving down, we stopped for lunch we thought we were stopping for lunch in North Carolina. On the highway was a Howard Johnson's, a nationally well-respected corporation serving good food. And when we went in there, the manager came out and just had an edict and said, "We're not going to serve you in this restaurant. Either you leave, you're going to be arrested." Well, I was prepared to be arrested at that point because I was building up. And we all sat around and said, "Look, our mission is to get down there. Let's just leave." And we did, and I'm glad we did. I mean, that could have been another incident. Maybe it might have evolved to something greater than what I did or what I got involved in or the people I met. But I don't regret having made that decision to just say, "Okay, we're out." I, ate that one and then traveled to Atlanta.
So you got to Atlanta, and tell me a little bit about what you were doing in Atlanta itself.
Basically, that was community organization, and at that time, my team leader was Andrew Young, Reverend Andrew Young. He was just a few years older than I. He was Dr. King's right-hand person, and we just first of all, we learned the principles of nonviolence, and we learned community organization and how to register voters, and then we were assigned very strategically certain areas, housing projects, areas to go out and not just register people to vote, but to do what was called political education as well, just talk about the Constitution, the importance, some of the history, people that have died, as a result of trying to vote, all of that good stuff. And we just went door to door, bars, barber shops, houses, churches, spoke, bringing our registration cards and registering people to vote.
And how long were you there for?
Well, I was only supposed to be there for 2 weeks, but I think I stayed for 4.
Yeah. And so then you travel back up to back to
Rhode school,
College, and then what we and then you're telling a little bit about getting involved in some of the stuff here, in Providence and in Rhode Island, at that point. So then, what was sort of the next phase for you in terms of your involvement?
Well, then what happened was I just got more and more intellectually and philosophically has historically engaged in Pan-African movement, what was going on in Africa, what was going on in the Caribbean, in Nkrumah and Jomo Kenyatta, a lot of the things that were occurring in Africa. So there was a simultaneous movement of things that were going on in the world, kind of a triangulation of things. And I recall even going to various seminars and learning about early on the African National Congress and Nelson Mandela, before that name was really, and reading an awful lot about Jomo Kenyatta and Nkrumah and about Nelson and all those folks that have since gone. So I then took on a larger look at the movement as being more international in scope and all connected in reality. And so I just sort of always engaged myself in various forums, involvements, direct action kinds of things, leading up to my senior year in college when Dr. King put out a call to challenge the Voting Rights Act of 1965, to test it to students around the country, and that was the biggie in terms of my involvement in Alabama and Mississippi.
So, where did you go first? You go to Alabama or Mississippi?
Well, basically, the reason why I say Mississippi, we were assigned. There were 360 or 70 or so students that were called for this testing of the Voting Rights Act of '65. Because even though the bill had been passed, there was still prohibitions in place, whole cultural things that were making it very difficult for people to register to vote. And so Dr. King felt that we needed to have a direct action program, challenge it, bring the federal government in where there was places were still operating from the old rules. For example, having the poll taxes was still in place, testing was wrong, having voting from 9 to 3 in the courthouse where the Ku Klux Klan would sit out on the porch 9 to 3 in the daytime, just the first Monday of the month. So everything to prevent people from coming to the polls. And just the threat. The Klan was always hanging around when there was a movement going on about registering people to vote. A lot of fear was in place. So the 300 or so students that were called in from around the country, and there were 7 of us from Rhode Island at that time, 6 from Brown University and myself from Rhode Island College. And we spent 1 week with Dr. King and Bayard Rustin and getting him really engaged in the Gandhian philosophy, getting involved in strategic planning, looking very clinically at what counties we were going to go after, where there was a large percentage of unregistered black voters. For example, the county that I was assigned to and us, the other 6 students, Choctaw County, which was right on the edge of the Mississippi border, right next door to Philadelphia. That's when I said my connections and my involvements were both in Mississippi. Mm-hmm. While they were officially in Alabama, I was also back and forth to Mississippi as well. And in our county, for example, there were over, say, 6,000 potentially voters that could register to vote over 21 years of age, and only 113 were registered to vote. So the challenge for us was to create an internal organization and to register over 1,000 voters during that summer, and to have a sustainability plan that allowed us, once we left, that there was leadership in place to carry it on.
Right. And one of the things that I talk with, that I've written about, but I also talk with my students about, is that, when you get a major piece of legislation, when you get any piece of legislation like a Voting Rights Act, that doesn't mean anything until people actually try to use it, right?
That's right.
And
no, you hit it right on it.
So this was very deliberate sort of, forcing of the issue to say, we need to make sure that this has real teeth, has real meaning in what we're doing. So it was under the auspices of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference then?
It was under the auspices of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. It was very interesting because a lot of my friends were with the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee.
Right.
And so we were always connecting on engaging together on various mobilization things in various parts of Alabama and Mississippi. And there were different philosophies in place. There was Stokely and there was Rapp, and there were those that were opposed to any notion of nonviolence. There was there was the New Orleans group. What was the name of the group? But they would take arms up against the Deacons,
Yeah.
which incidentally, it's unfortunate that he's not here. Malcolm Farmer, attorney Malcolm Farmer.
Yeah. He was here earlier today.
Oh, that's my guy. He and I are like that.
Yeah.
Oh no, we went to the 50th reunion together. Yeah. Well, Malcolm was here.
Yes.
Oh,
yes.
super. That's great.
And we talked briefly, but we're gonna talk more later. So hopefully,
okay.
We'll get
Is he
more.
going to be down here tonight?
I don't think he's going to be here tonight.
Oh, that's too bad. That's too bad. Great guy. We've been together since we were the two Rhode Islands, a black guy and a white guy, that did that thing and we've remained friends on a variety of issues throughout the years.
So when you got, this was summer of 1965,
right?
And you traveled down to Alabama.
Mm-hmm.
What was there? Was there a structure in place of someone that was coordinating this and said your team is going to go here and you're going to go here and this is this is where you're going to live? And this is, tell me a little bit about just the day-to-day experience.
Yeah, that was interesting. It really showed how well organized this whole event was, how this approach was. What Dr. King and the group had done was they had developed an organizational structure for all of this. And Hosea Williams was responsible for Alabama. And a guy named Sunshine, a guy named, oh my God. He was right in every picture you see on the bridge in Selma, Albert Turner. Okay. Great friend. Albert Turner and I were great friends. I was in touch with Albert almost daily. You see him every time I see the bridge, and there's Albert going on the ground and all that stuff. He's since passed. But they had an organizational structure with committed people, and they had identified local leadership, local ministers who had the courage and had their own parishes and owned their own homes as the leadership in these various places. And in my mind, that was, and then we stayed in their homes. And that's where the courage really wasn't with us going down there, Someone said there's a thin line between, I said, Mike, how did you, what motivated you to go down there? I said, well, there's a thin line between courage and crazy. And I said, I think there's something in between. But I said, the people that were there, they were the ones that were totally courageous because they were going to be there after we left. Mm-hmm. And to this day, I've always admired them as the unsung heroes.
Mm-hmm. It's just, in a lot of the historical literature, one of the contrasts that's made between SNCC and SCLC, at least SNCC in terms of what it was doing in Mississippi in 61, 62, 63, 64, is that they were preparing folks for the long haul, and they were organizing folks, and they were developing leadership that was going to be able to stay there after they had left. And the knock that you hear often on King is that they and SCLC were much more interested in mobilizing people for a big. But it sounds like what you're describing to me is that on the ground, at least there in West Alabama,
that's right, what
they were doing was very similar sort of model
Absolutely.
to what you folks associate with SNCC in Mississippi.
Well, I think the proof is in the pudding and in the eating. And when you look at what has happened over the years, the fact that the mobilization in Atlanta, serving that as the beachhead, and Dr. King's leadership, which was much more sustainable than SNCC's leadership over time, really served as the beachhead for Obama becoming president of the United States. A whole series of events in Atlanta happened where there were black, we had Maynard Jackson and Andrew Young. It all came out of that. And this isn't to downplay SNCC, because they were an important part of it. But in terms of sustainability, if I was to place credit on sustainability planning going forward, it all rested, for the most part, with Southern Christian Leadership Conference. Just from an organizational vantage point. From a advocacy, I'm not going to take this crap anymore. I love that part of SNCC. It kept things kind of in balance. So, yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So how long were you down there this time?
I stayed longer than I should have. Again, I went down in May. I graduated on a Saturday morning, Reverend Arthur Hodge, the guy whose statue's out in front of the Multicultural Center, he had organized a guy by the name of Irving Fain. He was a Jewish philanthropist who really supported the national civil rights movement. And he acquired 2 Valiant automobiles for 7 of us students to go there. Reverend Hodge organized all that, picked me up. My mother was, from the time I walked out of the house, she said, "Michael, please don't go." And joined the other 6 students. We got in those Valiants, took off on a Sunday morning, headed towards Alabama, and I stayed until supposed to come back in, I think it was late August, early September. Came back in October, but just stayed and just hung in there with the program, and it's been my greening, and I've really it's something I've always appreciated.
Mm-hmm. So you were knocking on doors and meeting with folks in their front rooms and
taking them down to the courthouse. I'll never forget it. Just marching down at the courthouse at a courthouse where, there was the Klan. They were visible, and stopping along the way to get some water or something in this little place, and they were there, and it wasn't. I don't know if it was tear gas or what, but they were behind the counters, and they tear gassed the place, or it was some kind of gas, pepper gas or something, and we had to get up out of there and regroup and then go down there and try to register to vote. And then when we were denied, we all needed to be denied and also confronted physically in order to send a letter or get contact with the federal government to say there's a violation of people's civil rights here in Choctaw. Then the government would then send somebody down. They'd open up the courthouse from 9 in the morning till 5 at night, 5 days a week with federal protection. And then we were able to register. That summer, I think we registered over 1,200 or 1,300, from 100 and up to 1,300, and we had the organization in place. Yeah.
So you down there till October, then you come back to Providence.
Yes.
At that point. So where did you go from there? What happens next?
Well, it was strange because I was scheduled to go to graduate school, and I was accepted at the University of Americas in Mexico, and I was accepted at the University of Sweden in Stockholm because I wanted to do international work. And then my roommate, we decided we would go to Mexico, and he went down there in September, and when he got down, he got sick. And he got very sick, almost died, in fact. And so that scared us. Decided, no, let me just go back, teach school, and figure out what I'm going to do. So I taught school.
What level of school did you teach?
The only job I could get at the time, because I came back late, the school department had at one of their middle schools the so-called 16 or 17 incorrigible young black and a few white kids in the school, and they figured that, and they needed a teacher, and I loved it because some of those guys played sports, and I knew I could handle them. I knew I could handle them. And I knew I would love them, and they would learn to appreciate me, not through being a nice guy, but balancing out, tough love with them. And so I took that job, and it was really, I got to share this story with you. So I took the job, and one of the things that I was doing, I would split the balance between doing academic stuff, taking them out, doing automobile mechanic stuff, or taking them out to the hatcheries, or taking them out into the country, or just going out and exposing them to a lot of different stuff, teaching black history and stuff like that, and getting real deep into it, deeper than what the administration wanted me to. And I could always feel it. I was always feeling like, I was not in step with the parade, I think you understand that concept. And then one day, they used to have in the middle schools, they would have these auditorium sessions where they would show the kids these wonderful travel logs, things around the world. So I brought my 16 guys down there to the auditorium, and they had beautiful Rhodesia, South Africa. And, this is right in the middle of my teaching people and trying to get them to understand that we're not slaves anymore. We don't have to be servants. We can become engineers and blah, blah, blah. And this picture was depicting, beautiful, beautiful Rhodesia and nothing but black servitude and waiters and white people and enjoying mint juleps. And it was just blowing my mind. I'm not a racist at all, but the principle of what was conflicting. So I told my class, I took one of my guys, I said, you take care of the class. I'm going into the office. I went and I protested it to the principal. And people all came and they said, what's the matter, Mike? The problem? I said, yeah, the problem's with, what you're doing here. And the look that I got and the reception I got, I could tell I didn't belong there because I was like Sisyphus. That rock was a little bit too heavy, So that was my decision to not teach in the school system because I just felt at that time it was just so I don't know, petrified that it was going to take, it would be like Sisyphus the rest of my life trying to make change within a public school system. I'm not saying that things haven't changed. But.
So how did you go about making change, after that?
Well, then after that, I just got involved in a lot of community development work and just started thinking practically how I get some folks some jobs, how I can create some hope, some opportunity, and just set up an organization called OIC with that same guy whose bust is out there by them.
Right.
He was my chairman. I was executive. Started with $3,000 and created an institution. This is a direct answer to your question. And we, after 18 years of doing that, we created what is now the CCRI building. We built that. We had all of our programs operating out of there, training thousands of Rhode Islanders to this day. Some have since retired. We acquired a machine company, which has evolved into the largest minority-owned supply chain management company in Rhode Island. Banneker Industries. We formed a nonprofit affordable housing corporation, which is hundreds and hundreds of housing units to this day, still doing that. We incubated the Rhode Island Black Heritage Society. That came out of all of that. So that kept me engaged. And simultaneously, to keep my advocacy thing going, I was asked by the community to challenge the city of Providence, the police department, on what was awful police brutality way back in the 60s and early 70s. And took the city, I was chairman of the Coalition Against Police Brutality, and took the city of Providence to the federal courts for 35 days and had 75 witnesses, including Marvin Barnes, who recently passed. And we made some changes in procedural things as it relates to the Providence Police Department. So that's what I did after that. And then I did that for 18 years and then got involved with consulting corporations and Native American groups around the country, and eventually did a lot of work with the Mashantucket tribe that built Foxwoods. And then I arrived back home, hung up my shingle about four years ago, set up my business, and I'm rebirthing the old OIC program in Rhode Island. I'm doing some construction management stuff and some urban and community development consulting.
You started this journey. This activism.
It was a journey. It was a journey.
So you started this, in 61, 62, 63, right? And you're continuing that on up into the 1980s and beyond. And looking back, there's an awful lot that changes, politically, economically, in the United States, between even 63 and 83, right?
Yep.
And between, so how can you speak a little bit to, and I know this is a big broad question, but can you speak a little bit to how that change, those political changes in particular, but even in the economic changes that were happening at the time, affected the kind of work that you were doing and what you felt maybe needed to be done and what you were able to accomplish?
Yeah, this will take another half-hour discussion. Let me try to put it in part of what drove me through my intellectual pursuits and the economic development of our country and all that was that whole issue of slavery and the economic impacts that slavery and had on the development of the capital here in the state of Rhode Island. I mean, you start a business with free labor, you can amass a lot. You can do capital formation unbelievable to leverage the industrial revolution and all that. So my thinking goes way back then, and so that whole issue of reparations, even though people never like to talk about it, that always drove me, because I always knew that our people had put in so much to the economic development of our state, and no one wanted to know anything about that. And yet, we were the last ones in to get hired for these jobs that paid and all that. Subsequently, we were the only ones that had to live by our wits. Many of us had to go to jail as a result of not having the kinds of opportunities to take care of our families. So all that stuff played on me. But I've calmed down a lot because I've got older, I guess, and I think we all do. But that has always guided what I've been thinking about and trying to change. And I think, to answer your question, a lot of things manifested over these past that period that has resulted in making America a much better place. And I think that there's now a solid awareness that there was something wrong, and that over 51% of our population bore that out by electing a black president. I mean, it just wasn't black people, it was people who felt he was the best person for the job. And that says a lot about our country. So I think that the civil rights movement brought all that on. And I think our country and our people, of all stripes, are a hell of a lot better now as a result of the civil rights movement. And I do think that history will record that President Obama will be one of our great presidents, given the challenges he faced internationally and locally, unlike anything anybody has had to deal with. But he's so damn smart, and we need intellectual capacity to figure our ways out of this, and how we connect with international leadership to figure our way out of it. It's unlike any other kind of leadership we ever had before. And I think history will record that he has provided that. But right now, he's subject to all the criticism from the simplistic-minded people who think there's just a simple, straightforward answer to solving this stuff.
As I've said it in conclusion of all these interviews, I could sit and talk with you for hours, and maybe we'll have a chance to do
I'd like
that.
to do that.
And dig more into. I want to hear more about the police brutality cases. I want to hear more about the housing stuff, and I want to, and I think that's all important stuff, and particularly because we often, think of, or folks in Rhode Island often think of the movement as what happened down there, and so being able to talk about how you were active there, but also doing some of that stuff here is important. So we'll talk about all that kind of wonderful stuff when we have our future conversation that I've just signed you up for. But one of the other things that we're also trying to do, at least with what we're capturing here, is the idea that students that are at URI can watch this, and other students can see this today, and hear from folks that got involved when they were the same age as them, and so about how they came to make some of these decisions, and what you and the other folks that are here decided to do with their lives as a result. And so I've been asking everybody if you could communicate something with some of the young people that maybe are viewing this, that we're going to work with these interviews with, about what they might take away from your experience and how they might apply it to some of what they're trying to do. What would that be?
I would say to the students, because I have my youngest son is a senior here now, that they have a tremendous opportunity to have a principled life. I know everybody needs a job. Everybody's trying to get a job, a career in a job. But there's two sides of a human being. You've got to sustain yourself economically, but you also got to sustain yourself psychologically, spiritually, philosophically. And life is short. I just remembered, just seemed like yesterday, 50-something years ago, 20-something years old, 20 years old, whatever, and not thinking about change and principled things and all that, and how gratifying it's been, at least for me and others that have gone through that. And I would just urge those students who have an inclination to become part of the solution in this life, and there's a need for many hands, and one person can make a big difference. I would just say it's a tremendous opportunity to get engaged. A lot of different ways and things to do. It doesn't have to be on civil rights issues. It could be on environmental issues. It could be on religious tolerance issues, whatever it is, but a principle, something that can help make a difference in the lives of individuals and country and the world. I think it's a tremendous opportunity. And we urge engagement and involvement.
Right. Great. Well, thank you for sitting with us today, and we will schedule that other conversation
Excellent.
Soon. So I think we're done.
Thank you. All right, Bob. That was great.